At 0430 hours, what began as a routine patrol shift aboard a United States Navy vessel quietly changed in a matter of seconds. Inside the Combat Information Center, the dimly lit nerve center of the ship, a young petty officer monitored his radar display as he had countless times before. The night was calm, maritime traffic was light, and nothing suggested that this watch would be any different from the last. Then the screen updated. 6 new contacts appeared almost simultaneously. They were not scattered or drifting, but aligned in a deliberate formation. Their movement patterns and electronic signatures immediately distinguished them from civilian vessels. These were not merchant ships or fishing boats. The contacts displayed the characteristics of naval warships operating with coordination and intent. Instinctively, the petty officer reached toward the general quarters alarm, aware that what he was seeing could represent a serious development. Before acting, he confirmed the data. Multiple sensors told the same story. The vessels were Venezuelan warships, and their position was not accidental. They were maneuvering directly across the projected transit path of the USS George Washington carrier strike group, which was operating lawfully in international waters. This was not a navigational error or a case of poor seamanship. It was a deliberate move. Within moments, senior watch officers joined the petty officer at the console. Information moved rapidly through the ship's command structure, and the atmosphere in the Combat Information Center shifted from routine to focused professionalism. There was no alarm, no raised voices, only quiet efficiency. Everyone present understood the significance of the encounter. Naval operations often hinge on perception, timing and restraint, and this situation demanded all three. From the Venezuelan perspective, the maneuver represented a calculated show of force. By placing their ships in the path of the American carrier group, they were signaling opposition to US naval presence in the Caribbean. It was a political message delivered through military positioning, yet from the American side, the situation looked very different. The USS George Washington is not merely a single vessel, but the centerpiece of a vast and layered defensive network designed to detect and respond to threats long before they become immediate dangers. Despite the imbalance in capability, a decision had been made in Caracas to proceed. The confrontation was based on the belief that resolve and visibility could challenge superior force. Back aboard the American vessels, automated systems fused sensor data into a clear operational picture. The carrier strike group adjusted subtly, maintaining course while preparing for every possible contingency. No weapons were fired, no warnings were issued, but the meaning of the moment was unmistakable. A routine patrol had become a test of judgment, discipline and professionalism. In every room, those early minutes, the future of the encounter depended not on firepower, but on the ability of both sides to understand the reality unfolding on their radar screens and to decide how far they were willing to go. As news of the American carrier strike group's movement spread beyond military channels, political reactions in the region followed quickly. Satellite imagery and maritime tracking data began circulating through international media, and within hours, attention turned toward Caracas. Venezuelan state outlets framed the presence of the USS George Washington and its escorts as a deliberate provocation, portraying the deployment as an attempt to intimidate and pressure the country despite the ships operating in international waters. At 0207 local time, the operational picture aboard the USS George Washington shifted decisively. Advanced sensors within the carrier strike group detected multiple fast-moving surface contacts approaching from the south, unlike the simplified radar returns seen by Venezuelan operators. The American systems immediately classified the contacts as small military vessels based on speed, maneuverability, and formation behavior. Within seconds, automated threat analysis software integrated the data into a comprehensive tactical display. The watch officer ordered an immediate transition from routine readiness to a higher alert condition. Additional personnel moved into the Combat Information Center, each taking pre-assigned positions without urgency or confusion. This was a well-rehearsed response, executed exactly as doctrine intended. The contacts continued to close distance at high speed. Their erratic movement patterns ruled out civilian traffic, and their coordinated approach suggested deliberate intent. 2 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters were cleared for launch, lifting off into the darkness to provide visual confirmation and extend the strike group's situational awareness beyond the radar horizon. Their mission was simple: identify, observe, and report. Electronic warfare specialists began monitoring low-power radio transmissions emanating from the approaching vessels. The signals were intermittent and encrypted, consistent with tactical communications rather than commercial use. At the same time, surface combatants within the group adjusted their positions. Guided missile destroyers subtly maneuvered to flank the carrier, while other ships shifted to create overlapping coverage zones. Despite the heightened readiness, the response remained deliberately restrained. No weapons were armed for immediate release, no fire control radars were activated. Over an open international frequency, a standardized maritime warning was broadcast, identifying the American warships and stating their lawful operation in international waters. The message was clear, calm, and non-confrontational. There was no reply. As the distance continued to shrink, the carrier strike group maintained course and speed, avoiding any movement that could be interpreted as escalation. Every action was governed by rules of engagement designed to preserve flexibility while ensuring self-defense. At this stage, the encounter had become a test of control rather than force. The United States Navy had achieved complete situational awareness, yet chose discipline over dominance. The outcome would now depend not on technological superiority, but on whether restraint on both sides could hold as the margin for error steadily narrowed. Visual confirmation soon arrived from the MH-60 Seahawk helicopters operating ahead of the carrier strike group. Through night vision optics, their crews observed 6 Venezuelan patrol vessels advancing in tight formation. Their wakes cut sharply through the dark water, illuminated faintly by reflected moonlight. The pattern was deliberate, controlled, and unmistakably military. This was no routine patrol and no accidental approach. Back aboard the USS George Washington, the Combat Information Center confirmed what radar analysis had already suggested. The vessels were approaching at speeds inconsistent with civilian traffic and maintaining formation discipline indicative of naval command and control. Weapons were visible on deck. Threat classification systems upgraded the contacts accordingly, marking them as probable hostile forces while still short of confirmed engagement status. Moments later, electronic warfare consoles registered a brief but unmistakable signal. One of the Venezuelan vessels had activated its fire control radar. Unlike general search radar, fire control systems are designed to provide precise targeting data for weapons. In naval operations, this action represents a say the response was immediate but measured. Defensive systems aboard the American ships automatically tracked the source of the emission, assigning targeting solutions without triggering weapons release. Close-in defense systems shifted to standby mode, sensors locking onto the approaching craft. Infrared cameras zoomed in, feeding high-resolution imagery to command staff. Despite the growing tension, the commanding officer maintained strict restraint. No return targeting was announced over open channels. No warning shots were fired. The order remained unchanged. Track, identify and hold fire unless fired upon. The patrol boat slowed and held position at a distance measured in thousands of yards, close enough to leave no doubt about intent, yet far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. For several moments, the sea itself seemed to pause. Engines idled, weapons remained uncovered but silent. Each crew on both sides waited for the next move. In naval encounters, this phase is often the most dangerous, not because of chaos, but because of stillness. A single misinterpreted signal, a nervous decision, or a technical error could instantly turn restraint into violence. In this frozen moment, discipline mattered more than firepower. The outcome rested not on who held the stronger weapons, but on who could maintain control when every system was ready to act. Without warning, the fragile stillness of the encounter broke. One of the Venezuelan patrol boats surged forward, its engines roaring as speed increased sharply. The vessel separated from the formation and began closing the distance toward the American ships at more than 40 knots. On radar displays aboard the carrier strike group, the contact's acceleration was immediate and unmistakable. Inside the Combat Information Center, range counters began to fall rapidly. The shift in movement transformed the situation from a controlled standoff into a potential engagement scenario. Warning signals were deployed. Bright green flares arced into the night sky from an American destroyer, the internationally recognized signal ordering an approaching vessel to alter course. And the message was clear and unambiguous. There was no immediate response. As the distance narrowed, every defensive system aboard the American ships transitioned into full tracking mode. Fire control solutions were calculated automatically, updated continuously as the patrol boat's course and speed changed, yet weapons remained unfired. The order to hold was maintained, even as the margin for error collapsed to seconds. Aboard the Venezuelan vessel, confusion replaced confidence. Radar returns became distorted, layered with interference and overlapping signals. What had appeared earlier as a single large target now resolved into multiple returns, stacked and unstable. The commander could finally see the physical outline ahead through the darkness, a massive silhouette rising from the sea, far larger than expected. This was no destroyer. At less than 1,000 yards, the patrol boat's engines throttled back abruptly, the bow dropped, and the vessel veered hard to port, throwing spray across its deck. The sudden manoeuvre broke the tension as quickly as it had formed. Within moments, the remaining patrol boats followed suit, abandoning their forward positions and turning away from the carrier strike group. No shots were fired, no missiles launched. But the significance of those few seconds was impossible to overstate. Had the patrol boat continued its approach for even a moment longer, defensive engagement would have been inevitable under established rules of engagement. This was the critical point of the encounter, the instant where discipline, hesitation, and late recognition prevented a political gesture from becoming a military catastrophe. The difference between escalation and restraint was measured not in minutes but in seconds, and both sides came closer to that boundary than the public would ever know. As the Venezuelan patrol boat broke away, the remaining vessels quickly followed. Formation discipline collapsed into controlled withdrawal as each ship altered course and turned south, their wakes overlapping as they increased distance from the American carrier strike group. On radar displays aboard the USS George Washington, the contacts shifted from converging tracks to diverging ones, confirming that the immediate danger had passed. Inside the Combat Information Center, defensive systems remained active for several minutes longer. Sensors continued tracking the retreating vessels, ensuring no sudden reversals or renewed approaches. Weapons stayed locked but unfired. Only when the Venezuelan ships faded into the broader radar picture did the atmosphere aboard the American vessels begin to ease. The commanding officer issued a single, measured order: maintain course and speed. There would be no pursuit, no additional signalling, and no attempt to exploit the situation tactically. The carrier strike group resumed its planned transit as if the encounter had never occurred. This restraint was intentional. In naval operations, pursuit after de-escalation can be misinterpreted as provocation, potentially reigniting a confrontation that had already been diffused. For the sailors on watch, the moment passed quietly. No alarm sounded, no announcements echoed through the ship. Yet everyone involved understood how close events had come to crossing an irreversible line. The difference between restraint and engagement had been measured in seconds and decisions made under pressure. On the Venezuelan side, the withdrawal preserved lives and assets, even if it left unanswered questions about how the situation had been allowed to unfold. The patrol boats returned toward their home ports at standard cruising speed, maintaining enough formation discipline to signal control rather than panic. Whatever orders were being issued from shore, the immediate objective had shifted from confrontation to disengagement. At sea, silence returned. The Caribbean appeared calm once more, betraying no sign of the tension that had filled the night hours earlier. Yet for those who had watched the radar screens and tracked the closing distances, the encounter would not be forgotten. It was logged, analysed, and added to a long history of near misses that define modern naval operations. This phase of the incident demonstrated a central truth of maritime security. De-escalation is not accidental. It is the result of discipline, adherence to procedure, and commanders willing to resist momentum. In this case, restraint, not firepower, ultimately shaped the outcome. By the time daylight spread across the Caribbean, the physical confrontation had ended, but the information battle was only beginning. Footage recorded aboard Venezuelan patrol boats, much of it low resolution and heavily cropped, began circulating across local media and social platforms. The images showed distant silhouettes of American warships on the horizon, framed in a way that suggested withdrawal rather than passage. Within hours, Venezuelan state television interrupted regular programming to broadcast the clips. Anchors described the encounter as a successful assertion of maritime sovereignty, claiming that Venezuelan naval forces had forced a powerful foreign fleet to alter its course. The narrative spread quickly through regional outlets, amplified by social media accounts, aligned with government messaging. Context was stripped away, timing, distance, and maritime law were left unexplained. From a strategic standpoint, this phase of the incident was as important as the encounter at sea. In modern conflicts, perception often travels faster than verified information. A controlled retreat can be reframed as victory, and restraint can be portrayed as weakness if left unanswered. The US response was deliberate and restrained. Rather than engaging in rhetorical escalation, American officials released precise, verifiable data. Satellite imagery, AIS records, and timestamped navigation logs demonstrated that the USS George Washington carrier strike group had remained well outside Venezuelan territorial waters throughout the incident. The data showed continuous course and speed, contradicting claims of retreat. Diplomatic channels activated quietly. Communications between Washington and Caracas moved through established intermediaries, including neutral third-party states, to prevent public escalation. The goal on both sides was containment, ensuring that a tactical encounter did not evolve into a political crisis. Inside military headquarters, analysts began dissecting the incident frame by frame. Radar logs, communications transcripts, and system responses were reviewed to identify procedural strengths and potential vulnerabilities. For naval planners, the encounter became a case study in how quickly miscalculation could escalate and how narrowly it had been avoided. Publicly, the incident faded within days, replaced by other headlines. Privately, it remained significant. The story underscored a defining feature of modern maritime confrontation. Even when no shots are fired, narratives can clash just as fiercely as ships at sea. And in that space between reality and perception, strategic consequences can quietly take shape. In the days that followed, the encounter was studied closely inside military and intelligence circles. Frame by frame, analysts reviewed radar logs, communications data, and system responses to understand how a political signal had come so close to triggering a military disaster. The conclusion was consistent across assessments. The incident was not the result of chance, but of discipline on one side and miscalculation on the other. For Venezuela, the mistakes began long before the first ship left port. Decisions were shaped by outdated technology, incomplete situational awareness, and political assumptions that underestimated the complexity of modern naval warfare. Radar systems designed for a simpler era failed to distinguish a layered carrier strike group from a single surface contact. That technical limitation cascaded upward into strategic error, placing sailors and ships into a confrontation they were never equipped to win. The American response followed a different logic. From the moment of detection, the carrier strike group adhered strictly to established procedures. Sensors detected first, systems verified, commanders maintained control. Even when fire control radar was briefly activated against the carrier, an action considered a serious escalation under maritime rules, the response remained restrained. Weapons were ready but not released. That restraint was not hesitation, it was doctrine. Modern naval power is often measured in missiles, aircraft and tonnage. Yet this encounter highlighted a more decisive factor: control over escalation. The United States Navy demonstrated that dominance does not require immediate force. It requires the ability to absorb provocation without losing command of the situation. Discipline, information superiority, and clarity of decision-making proved more influential than any single weapon system. Perhaps most importantly, the incident revealed how narrow the margin for error has become in contemporary maritime operations. Detection timelines are measured in seconds. Engagement decisions unfold faster than human instinct alone can manage. In such an environment, misjudgment carries consequences that escalate with extraordinary speed. No ships were damaged, no lives were lost. But the lesson endured. At sea, the most dangerous weapon is not a missile or a torpedo, it is a mistake. And in an age where perception, technology and politics intersect in increasingly crowded waters, avoiding that mistake requires more than power. It requires restraint. Government officials described the carrier's transit as a challenge to Venezuelan sovereignty, even though no territorial boundaries had been crossed. The narrative was carefully constructed for both domestic and regional audiences, emphasizing resistance and national resolve. In response, Venezuela's leadership authorized an increase in military readiness, signaling that the situation was no longer being treated as a routine naval movement. Along the northern coast, radar stations increased their scan rates and began actively tracking the American formation. Naval commands issued alerts to coastal units, and fishing vessels were instructed to remain clear of designated maritime areas. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. What had been a distant geopolitical development was now treated as an immediate operational concern. Inside Venezuelan command centres, officers monitored incoming data while attempting to assess intent. The carrier strike group's movements were lawful and predictable, but their scale carried symbolic weight. To Venezuelan leadership, allowing such a force to pass without response risked appearing passive. In regional politics, perception often matters as much as reality, and this moment was framed as a test of credibility. At the same time, internal limitations shaped the available options. Venezuela's Navy and Air Force had faced years of maintenance challenges, spare parts shortages, and reduced operational readiness. While coastal radar and surface vessels were available, the ability to sustain a prolonged confrontation was limited. Nevertheless, the decision was made to demonstrate presence rather than restraint. Back aboard the American ships, the reaction was markedly different. There was no political messaging, no public statements, and no change in demeanour. Watchstanders continued their duties with measured calm, logging radar emissions and communications from the coast. The carrier strike group remained at standard readiness, following established rules of engagement designed to reduce the risk of miscalculation. The contrast between political urgency on shore and procedural discipline at sea highlighted a recurring dynamic in modern naval encounters. While governments respond to symbolism and narrative, sailors operate within doctrine and law. As both sides adjusted their posture, the gap between perception and capability widened, setting the stage for decisions that would test whether escalation could still be avoided. Shortly after midnight, Venezuelan coastal radar operators detected what appeared to be a large surface contact moving steadily north of the coastline. The return was strong, consistent, and deliberate. Based on its speed, heading and radar profile, it was assessed as a single American warship, most likely a guided missile destroyer, operating independently in international waters. To the operators watching their screens, the contact looked manageable. What they did not realise was that this assessment was built on a critical technical limitation. Venezuela's coastal surveillance network relied on aging radar systems and legacy signal processing software, much of it designed decades earlier for far simpler maritime environments. In modern naval operations, Large formations generate complex radar reflections. Multiple vessels operating in close coordination can appear as a single merged contact when detected by outdated systems, especially when electronic countermeasures and horizon effects are involved. In this case, reflections from the USS George Washington and its escorts overlapped, producing what radar operators interpreted as one large target rather than a carrier strike group. The data was not obviously incorrect, it was incomplete. The system did exactly what it was designed to do, but it was never designed to interpret a modern, multi-layered naval formation. This misidentification marked the first true mistake of the encounter. Acting on delayed and simplified information, Venezuelan command believed they were facing an opportunity to conduct a limited intercept rather than a confrontation with overwhelming force. The assumption shaped every decision that followed. From the radar room, the contact appeared isolated. Its steady course suggested predictability, and its perceived size did not immediately trigger alarm. There was no indication, at least not from the available data, that multiple escorts were maneuvering nearby or that additional sensors were already tracking Venezuelan movements in real time. In modern naval warfare, the failure of technology is rarely dramatic. Systems do not suddenly go dark or display obvious errors. Instead, they present a convincing but incomplete picture. Operators trust what they see, especially when it aligns with expectations shaped by political guidance and prior assumptions. The coastal radar operators did not make a reckless decision. They made a reasonable one based on flawed inputs. But at sea, even small technical misinterpretations can cascade into strategic consequences. By mistaking a complex naval formation for a single ship, Venezuela's command structure set in motion a chain of events rooted not in aggression, but in miscalculation. And once assets were committed based on that assumption, reversing course would become far more difficult. Based on the assessment provided by coastal radar stations, Venezuelan Naval Command authorized a limited intercept operation. The objective was not to initiate combat, but to demonstrate presence and resolve by approaching what was believed to be a single American warship operating near Venezuelan-controlled waters. The decision reflected confidence in the available intelligence and a belief that a controlled show of force could send a political message without provoking escalation. Within minutes, orders were transmitted to naval units stationed at nearby ports. 6 fast patrol boats were selected for the mission. These vessels were designed for coastal defence and interdiction, capable of high speed and rapid manoeuvring in shallow waters. Lightly armoured and equipped with machine guns and short-range rockets, they were well suited for signalling intent, but not for sustained engagements against major surface combatants. As the boats departed their docks under radio silence, diesel engines roared to life, sending white spray into the dark water. Navigation lights were extinguished and the formation accelerated northward at speeds exceeding 30 knots. From the perspective of their commanders, the operation was straightforward: close distance, establish visual contact, issue warnings if necessary, and then reassess. The crews were experienced in regional patrols, but had limited exposure to encounters involving carrier strike groups. Their situational awareness depended heavily on data provided earlier by shore-based radar, much of which was already outdated by the time the boats reached open water. The assumption that they were approaching a lone destroyer shaped their tactics and confidence. Unseen to them, the tactical environment was far more complex. The USS George Washington and its escorts had already adjusted their formation, creating layered defensive coverage across the surface, air, and subsurface domains. Advanced sensors tracked the patrol boats from the moment they left port, updating their positions continuously, yet none of this was visible on the patrol boats' simplified displays. At this stage, the encounter remained entirely reversible. No weapons were aimed, no warnings were exchanged, but momentum had taken hold. Once vessels were underway and closing distance, turning back would require new orders and a willingness to challenge initial assumptions. The decision to intercept, grounded in confidence and incomplete information, transformed a political signal into a tactical commitment. From that moment forward, every minute reduced the margin for error and increased the risk that misinterpretation